In the past 14 years as a photographer, both as a hobbyist and as a professional, my favorite genre of photography has consistently been portraiture. And in this video, I want to share with you my favorite piece of advice to give to create more meaningful and more thoughtful portraits. But first, a little context. Last month when Eric and I were on our way back from our trip to Maui, we had a 24-hour layover in LA. We made the most of that time by meeting up with Sam Newton, who is a fellow filmmaker and YouTuber, and we got to interview him for Rally Caps, which was super fun, and you should check out that episode of the podcast if you haven't already. And we also walked around his neighborhood, got to hang out with him a little bit, and just take some photos together. Before we left his apartment to head to the airport to catch our flight, I did take one more portrait of him in front of his signature neon sign. I directed him to sit exactly how I wanted him to look, kind of had him tilt his head a little bit and position his body, and as I reached for my camera to take his portrait, he smiled and he said, "Man, I like what you just did right there. You kind of positioned me, you directed me before you touched your camera. You talked to me. I've never really seen anyone do that before." I don't know if you noticed it when I was explaining what I was doing before taking the photo, but Sam noticed it too. I talked with him before I even touched my camera. I directed him to sit exactly how I wanted him to sit before bringing the camera up to my eye. And that is the key piece of advice that I want to communicate today. I think it's so powerful to actually interact with your subject before touching your camera. And I know that might sound a little simple, like it's not the most life-changing piece of advice ever, but it is something that I think breaks a habit that a lot of us have. I think it's really easy to just always want to have your camera up to your eye. And that might be from being a wedding photographer. I don't know, I'm always looking for moments that are happening on a wedding day. I like to anticipate things that are happening. I like to be ready before the action happens. But I think there's something really powerful about having the time and the space to put your camera to the side and actually talk with the person who's sitting across the lens from you. I think we've all been in that position before where we have our camera up to our eye and our subject is maybe asking us, how do they look and what should they do? And we're kind of giving them half answers because we're too focused on what settings we want to use or what the light looks like or for any other visual distractions in the frame. And it sometimes feels like you're not actually establishing a connection with them so much as you're just trying to fire off as many frames as you possibly can. I originally learned this technique from one of my favorite photographers, Platon. He is an iconic portrait photographer, and he actually has an episode on the Netflix documentary series, Abstract. That's where I first learned about him and his work, and just by watching him interact with his subjects and also listening to his philosophy on portraiture, I became obsessed with the idea of really establishing that connection, that human connection with the person that you're photographing. And even though this is kind of a simple tip and a simple piece of advice to give, the real challenge with it is remembering to do it. Because as much as I love it and as much as I've incorporated it into my workflow, it's still not my first instinct sometimes. Sometimes I'm just, really wanting to keep my camera up to my face. And there are days where I really have to fight that, but I've always found it worthwhile to practice this technique, to get better at it, and to make it the first thought that comes to mind when I'm starting to take a portrait of someone. To leave the camera to the side, to talk with them, direct them, help them feel at ease, and ultimately create better and more meaningful portraits. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you to Sam for inspiring this video in the first place, and I'll catch you in the next one.